The summer of 1940 smelled of oil and ozone. Above the patchwork fields of southern England, the sky roared with a new kind of thunder, the sound of two nations deciding the fate of the free world through wings and willpower. On one side flew the Supermarine Spitfire, Britain's elegant defender, slim, elliptical, almost fragile in silhouette, its Merlin engine singing like a symphony of precision. On the other side came Germany's Messerschmitt Bf 109, knife-nosed, predatory, and brutally efficient, the weapon that had already conquered the skies of Europe. These were not just aircraft. They were opposites pressed into motion, two different answers to the same question: how do you win the sky? In May 1940, the British Expeditionary Force had barely escaped Dunkirk. France had fallen. Hitler stood looking west across the Channel. The invasion of Britain, Operation Sea Lion, required one thing above all: air superiority. The Luftwaffe, confident after sweeping victories in Poland and France, prepared to crush the Royal Air Force in a matter of weeks. But in the hangars of southern England, among the twisted wreckage of Dunkirk's evacuation, a slender miracle waited. The Spitfire, conceived by visionary designer R.J. Mitchell, embodied everything restrained, stubborn, and ingenious about Britain itself. Where the German industrial machine marched toward ruthless efficiency, the Spitfire flowed with artistry. Its elliptical wing, a masterpiece of aerodynamics, provided perfect balance between lift and speed, a wing as graceful as it was deadly. The Bf 109, designed by Willy Messerschmitt, was its mirror image: angular, metallurgical, clipped like a hawk's beak. Powered by the Daimler-Benz DB 601, it climbed like lightning and struck in vertical dives that punished the slow. It was aircraft as blade, built for hunters, not dancers. In laboratory terms, the two fighters looked evenly matched. The early Spitfire Mach 1 could reach 580 km per hour, while the Bf 109E3 just edged past 590. Both carried 8 guns. Both fought on numbers thinner than anyone liked. Both were worked to exhaustion by men barely out of their 20s. But numbers never told the true difference between them, because superiority in the air is not arithmetic, it's philosophy. The rivalry had spirit long before the Battle of Britain truly began. British pilots emerging from training heard legends whispered even then, stories of the Messerschmitt's climb, its fuel injection systems that allowed it to dive without stalling. But Luftwaffe pilots knew of the Spitfire too. They called it Die verdammte Ente, the damned duck, because it could turn tighter than logic allowed. In a purely mechanical sense, the Bf 109 had advantages: variable pitch propellers, automatic leading-edge slats giving lift at high angles, and a canopy trimmed for visibility above. It was a pilot's fighter, heavy-handed but reliable, the perfect weapon for Germany's short, precise wars. The Spitfire was something rarer, a machine that felt alive. Pilots described it not as operated, but worn. Its controls spoke through pressure, not force. When a pilot banked a Spitfire, it didn't turn, it flowed, carving through airflow like water slipping around stone. The Battle of Britain would decide which vision of air power, science or instinct, would hold the world's future. On July 10, 1940, the first great test came roaring across the Channel. Scramble orders flashed through southern airfields. Engines screamed as propellers bit into damp air. And then, like actors storming a stage, Spitfires and Bf 109s met in cloud-silvered sunlight that would turn both men and machines into legends. For pilots, dogfighting wasn't a duel of technology. It was a duel of nerve. Altitude was life. Surprise, salvation. Squadrons spiraled, each formation like a living organism built from fear and adrenaline. The Bf 109s fought with surgical doctrine, boom and zoom attacks, striking in vertical dives, breaking away before British guns could track. The Spitfires fought by instinct, sweeping turns, playing for persistence, using that magical elliptical wing to cut tighter radii and stay on the enemy's tail a heartbeat longer. That heartbeat was everything. The first recorded combat between Spitfire and Bf 109 took place above the Channel coast near Dover. The German pilot, experienced, dived from altitude expecting the British fighter to stall mid-climb. But the Spitfire's Merlin engine held power in a way no German economist could have explained. It clawed into the sky, turned inside the prey, and filled the horizon with 8 streams of tracer fire. The German bailed out, and from that day forth, both sides abandoned arrogance. Now they respected what they fought. As the weeks burned on, the sky became an anvil. British radar stations tracked waves of raids. Controllers vectored squadrons, measured not in formation but in survival. For every sortie launched by the Luftwaffe, Britain replied with fewer aircraft, but never lesser pilots. Underground newspapers called the pilots the few. They were far more than that. They were the thin line between two philosophies of civilization, precision industry versus human craftsmanship. By late August, the difference between the two fighters became a pattern carved in gunpowder. The Bf 109 could climb, dive, and strike faster, but it had range only for 20 minutes of combat over England before it had to turn home or fall. The Spitfire, fighting above its own soil, needed no ocean to cross. Its pilots knew every cloud, every coastline, every farm beneath them. That advantage, not metal but home, would change the world. By the autumn of 1940, smoke loops over southern England painted the evolution of flight in every shade of fire and contrail. The Battle of Britain had transformed both the Spitfire and the Messerschmitt Bf 109 from prototypes into philosophy. Each new engagement forced engineers and pilots alike to reimagine what air warfare could demand. The equations of superiority were changing faster than factories could follow. At Supermarine's plant in Southampton, engineers worked sleepless nights by the flicker of blackout lamps, drafting the Spitfire Memcock II and later the Memcock V. They reinforced the airframe, tuned the Rolls-Royce Merlin Swellum to deliver nearly 200 horsepower, and strengthened the propeller spinner for faster climb through low clouds. Across the Channel, in Augsburg, Willy Messerschmitt's design bureau mirrored that frenzy. The Bf 109F, sleeker and faster than its predecessor, rolled into production in early 1941, its edges rounded to reduce drag, its engine upgraded to the DB601E supercharged unit. On paper, the rivals were again evenly matched. In the air, subtle distinctions began to decide who lived and who fell. Engineering, precision versus poetry. The Bf 109 embodied German industrial precision. Every panel was cut to efficiency, every line of the airframe measured against aerodynamic theory. But it was designed within constraints of doctrine, optimized for short, aggressive sorties launched from forward bases. The cockpit was narrow, visibility sliced by heavy framing. Ground crews admired its simplicity. Pilots respected its lethality but rarely adored it. The Spitfire was something else entirely. Its designer, R.J. Mitchell, had masterminded seaplanes that danced across oceans before war clouds gathered. The Spitfire carried that elegance into combat. The elliptical wing wasn't just an artistic flourish. It reduced drag and distributed lift so evenly that the aircraft turned with supernatural smoothness. Pilots said the Spitfire could outroll its pilot's imagination. In Germany, order produced precision. In Britain, desperation produced innovation. When early Spitfires met the latest Messerschmitts, both sides took notes through gun sights. The RAF noticed how German fuel-injected engines could dive without choking. The Merlin's carburetor still starved under negative G maneuvers. Spitfire pilots improvised. They half-rolled and pulled downward instead of pushing, a workaround both dangerous and oddly British. They would not let imperfection dictate surrender. Engineers soon answered with a tiny brass restrictor plate called the Miss Schilling's orifice, invented by a female mathematician at Farnborough. It stabilized fuel flow, a simple solution that erased one of Germany's few mechanical advantages. At the same time, German intelligence examined downed British aircraft and found reliability bordering on the romantic. Wiring looms labeled by color, interchangeable components, instrument dials that glowed faintly for night operation, details subtle yet vital. Where the Bf 109 demanded discipline, the Spitfire forgave. In wartime, forgiveness often outweighed order. Pilots and philosophy. Technical equality meant little without the men in the cockpit. The contrast between British and German training mirrored their machines. Luftwaffe fighter doctrine emphasized aggression. Pilots were trained under the mentorship of Spanish Civil War veterans, real aces who preached the gospel of individual initiative. Strike hard, climb, and dive again, they taught. Combat was about altitude, not romance. Accurate gunnery, perfect timing, and formation discipline were everything. Britain's approach was rougher, instinctive. Many pilots had logged fewer than 200 hours before facing combat. Their instructors focused on teamwork. A formation of Spitfires acted like a single consciousness, each pilot trusting the wingman's life to his own reflexes. The system was less mechanical, more emotional. It turned squadrons into families and airfields into tribes. In the cockpit, the difference became visceral. The Bf-109's control column, heavy and stiff, punished hesitation. The Spitfire, by contrast, flowed with the pilot's fingertips. Its controls had no cables slack, no latent resistance. One RAF veteran later said, "It didn't feel like you flew it. It felt like you only thought about turning," and the aircraft agreed. For Luftwaffe pilots, such intimacy bordered on madness. They respected the Spitfire. They feared its persistence. Each time a formation of Messerschmitts climbed above southern England, they knew fuel would force them home after 20 minutes of battle. The Spitfire pilots, fighting mere miles from their bases, could chase them until the Channel swallowed the horizon. By winter 1940, the illusion of German invincibility cracked not through destruction, but denial. The Luftwaffe had failed to break Britain's air defense. The invasion of England faded into whispers, and in that narrow victory, the Spitfire began its transformation from local protector to global symbol. Evolution into legends. As the war spread, the rivalry followed. When the Luftwaffe swept into North Africa, Spitfires soon reached desert airfields assembled from shipping crates. Camouflaged in sand yellow, they met the latest Bf-109F and 19G variants over Tobruk and El Alamein. Conditions tortured both machines, sand-scoured engines, heat-warped wings, but the philosophies remained clear. German engineers pursued higher power, British engineers pursued balance. The 19G, known as the Gustav, mounted the DB-605 engine, delivering one 450 horsepower and heavier 20mm and 30mm cannon. It was faster at altitude, but heavier in feel, its refined predator nature beginning to stiffen under weight. The Spitfire countered with continuous iteration, new engines, clip tips for climb, strengthened fuselage for dive. By 1943, Spitfire Mekak wings with the Merlin 61 matched the DB-605 at almost every parameter, yet retained their light touch. To fly either machine demanded art and survival in equal parts. One Luftwaffe ace described the 109 this way: "She rewards the brave and kills the clumsy." A British veteran replied decades later, "The Spitfire never punished me for being human." In those few words rested the entire moral of their duel. As more Allied fighters filled the skies, Hurricanes, P-40s, P-51 Mustangs, the Spitfire and Messerschmitt remained the archetypes. Each upgrade mirrored the other's shadow: better superchargers, higher ceilings, new gun fittings. The rivalry evolved beyond combat into mutual respect measured in stolen moments over contrails. Pilots sometimes met after battles when one was forced down over Allied or Axis territory. One recorded encounter tells of a young German who crash-landed on the English coast and was captured by local soldiers. When shown a grounded Spitfire at the airfield, he walked around it in silence before remarking softly, "We chased her for miles, and she never slowed." The human mathematics of air superiority. By 1944, experience had clarified what the Battle of Britain had hinted. The Spitfire's advantage was not brute speed or firepower, but endurance and adaptability. Its frame accepted change like a living organism. It welcomed new Merlin types, then the great 2,000 horsepower Griffin engine. Its wing design allowed weapons from .303 Browning machine guns to 20mm Hispanos without structural trauma. The Bf-109, though continuously improved, had begun to suffer the weight of its own creation. Its narrow landing gear, hallmark of Messerschmitt's compact design, caused countless takeoff and landing accidents. Its nose-mounted cannon gave surgical killing power but restricted field of vision. Supply shortages forced aluminum substitutes, field repairs with inferior metals. Excellence without resources becomes fragility. Above Normandy in 1944, Spitfire Memcot Wines and 14s owned the daytime sky. German aircraft could still strike with terrifying precision, but they could not stay aloft long enough to dominate. Logistics favored the flexible. Industrial philosophy had decided what bullets and pilots could not. In one of his last journal entries, a captured Luftwaffe engineer summed up what decades of historians would later repeat. "They built for the man. We built for the machine." and the man outlived us. The duel that began as a contest of horsepower had become a testament to empathy, to understanding how technology should serve its master, not enslave him. The skies over Europe in 1944 carried a different sound, heavier, faster, more relentless. The echoes of the old duel between the Spitfire and the Bf 109 still lingered, but the balance of air power had shifted irreversibly. What began as a contest of equals was now an elegy for one side's perfection carried too far. The Luftwaffe was fracturing. Fuel shortages bled its wings, factories bombed around the clock turned out fewer aircraft and fewer trained pilots to fly them. The Bf 109, once the mechanical spearhead of blitzkrieg, became a symbol of exhaustion. Its design had reached the edge of adaptability. When Messerschmitt introduced the Bf 109 K4, the final wartime version, even its own pilots called it the perfection of a mistake. It could still climb faster than any Spitfire, could still dive like a hawk, but inside its narrow cockpit, the pilot fought the aircraft as much as the enemy. Takeoffs demanded prayer and landings killed more Germans than gunfire. The Spitfire, by contrast, was entering its renaissance. The new Mach 14, powered by the Rolls-Royce Griffon 65, ripped through clouds at 710 km per hour and climbed past 40,000 feet. The elliptical wing, born on blueprints before war began, proved timeless. Engineers merely adjusted its profile, never its soul. The Merlin had sung, the Griffon growled. It no longer danced, one pilot said, it hunted. Post-D-Day, the Spitfire no longer fought above its homeland, it followed the war across Europe. Daylight patrols from Belgian fields to the Rhine meant constant sorties, and everywhere the story repeated. German aces flew with unmatched skill, yet their machines carried the burden of a failing empire. Still, in those hopeless months, the Bf 109 refused to surrender its dignity. Luftwaffe pilots, many barely 20 years old, took off against impossible odds, climbing through flak and contrails to meet waves of Allied bombers escorted by Mustangs and Spitfires. Their enemy was now time itself. Captured files after the war reveal the desperation behind that courage. Ground crews poured alcohol and synthetic fuel mixtures into engines meant for high-octane aviation petrol. Spare parts went missing. Cannibalized 109s littered every field from Denmark to Austria. Yet on clear mornings, the old warrior still took off, the sound of the DB-605 echoing across fields like memory itself. In January 1945, Luftwaffe Command issued an analysis comparing engagement survival rates. A trained German pilot had roughly 12 combat sorties before being lost. RAF and USAF pilots averaged over 100. The reason went beyond numbers. The Spitfire's mechanical reliability allowed constant practice and safe return. The Bf 109's fragility and lack of fuel restricted flight hours. War had turned innovation into entropy. One of the last head-to-head encounters came above the Rhine in March 1945. A formation of Spitfire Mach 14s from No. 41 Squadron met a flight of Bf 109 K4s escorting bombers fleeing west. They sighted each other almost simultaneously, stark green against silver sky. The ensuing dogfight lasted only 5 minutes. The Germans, short on fuel, could make just one high-speed pass before retreating east. One Spitfire was damaged. 3 Messerschmitts fell. The survivors scattered like shrapnel into their own homeland's smoke. It was the end of an era. Engineering autopsies. When victory finally silenced Europe's skies, both nations turned from flight to dissection. At Farnborough and Cranfield, captured Bf 109s stood stripped beside gleaming Spitfires for post-war trials. British engineers admitted, with real admiration, that Germany had wrung every ounce of speed from limited resources. The Messerschmitt's fuel-injected Daimler-Benz engine remained a marvel of precision. Its direct injection system and adjustable leading-edge slats offered aerodynamic brilliance. But the reports revealed the fatal contrast: delicacy versus durability. German designs required meticulous maintenance, specialist tools, and high-grade fuel. Allied aircraft, particularly the Spitfire and later the robust Mustang, were engineered for field repair, built from parts that could be swapped by torchlight under rain. The verdict was not about flight performance. Both machines excelled. The verdict was about philosophy of design. Britain had learned the secret Keller would later teach at Kummersdorf: reliability over perfection. A Royal Aircraft Establishment memorandum written in November 1945 summarized it coldly. The German fighter was an engineer's triumph, but a logistician's nightmare. The Spitfire was a mechanic's dream, and therefore, statistically, the better weapon. German test pilots who evaluated captured Spitfires after their surrender echoed that conclusion. One veteran, Oberleutnant Herbert Kohler, wrote in his diary, "It feels alive in the hand, not faster than ours, but more willing to forgive mistakes. Perhaps that is why it won." Mutual respect among survivors. As Europe rebuilt, a peculiar fraternity grew between former enemies. Airmen met at post-war symposiums and flight demonstrations where old foes became collaborators. When RF veterans visited airfields in a divided Germany, they found their counterparts full of conflicting pride. Many Luftwaffe aces admitted that, in hindsight, their perfectionism had betrayed them. "We treated airplanes like instruments," one pilot confessed, "and forgot they were lifeboats." Spitfire pilots, too, refused arrogance. They respected the Bf-109 as the crucible that honed their skills. "Without them, we might never have become what history calls the few," Group Captain Douglas Bader said later. "They taught us exactly how far skill could reach before fear." The aircraft themselves embodied their nation's post-war transformation. In Britain, Spitfires patrolled peacetime skies until 1954, beautifully anachronistic against the first jet contrails of the Cold War. In occupied Germany, surviving 109s continued service under new flags, rebuilding air forces in Spain, Switzerland, even Israel. Every time those engines started, they whispered of a time when machinery measured courage. The final technical truth. Historians have argued for decades whether the Spitfire or Bf-109 was superior. The final answer hides not in statistics, but in purpose. The two machines were designed for different wars. The Bf-109 was built for short campaigns, fast conquests, and nearby airfields. It excelled at offense. The Spitfire was built for defense, endurance, accessibility, the long haul. When the war stretched beyond its architects' imaginations, philosophy decided what engineering could not. In the words of one British engineer reviewing both aircraft in 1946, "The Messerschmitt was a rapier that required precision to kill. The Spitfire was a sword that could make every pilot feel he was born for it." Perfection was less important than partnership, that invisible thread connecting man and machine. The Spitfire carried its pilots, even when exhausted, back over the channel again and again. The Messerschmitt often left its own stranded by its limits. And in the ledger of history, machines that bring men home write their own victory. As the sun set on Europe's age of propellers, both aircraft faded from arsenal to legend. Their silhouettes, preserved in memorials and flight museums, remind later generations that genius wears many faces, one angular and disciplined, the other curved and forgiving. Together they mark the peak of piston-engine artistry, the moment when human instinct and mechanical evolution balanced perfectly before the jet age shattered it. When the Second World War finally ended, the skies over Europe grew quiet for the first time in 6 years. But the silence did not feel like peace. It sounded like two engines cooling, one German, one British, as if even machines were exhaling. For the pilots of both nations, the war had left them bound to ghosts made of aluminum, rivets, and wings. Most never saw their aircraft again. Yet both the Spitfire and the Messerschmitt Bf-109 refused to fade into ordinary history. They became myths, carried forward not by propaganda or national pride, but by reverence. Because within each fuselage had lived something more than war, proof of what people can achieve when belief and necessity light the same forge. Rebuilding from fragments, post-war Europe was a scrapyard of wings. Airfields once filled with Spitfires and Messerschmitts now lay strewn with twisted frames, engines stripped for metal, hangars turned into shelters for refugees. But tucked among the ruins were surviving aircraft that refused to die. RAF engineers refurbished hundreds of Spitfires for the New World, taking shape behind peace conferences and barbed wire. They served across continents, in Egypt, in Burma, in occupation zones of Japan. In Germany, where production lines had fallen silent, a few intact Bf-109s found second lives. Spain contracted engineers who had fled the collapse of the Reich to assemble them from leftover parts, calling their version the Hispano HA-1112. Ironically, those Spanish 109s would star in films about the Battle of Britain decades later, German aircraft reborn as actors reenacting their own past. History, amused by irony, let the defeated plane keep flying. A handful of surviving Luftwaffe engineers were approached by Allied research teams. At Farnborough, those who had crafted the Bf 109 met their British counterparts over tea and data sheets. They compared weight distribution charts, engine airflow graphs, and quietly marveled that in pursuit of destruction, they had been thinking almost identically all along. One of them, Dr. Kurt Tank of Focke-Wulf fame, murmured, "We were not enemies. We were colleagues in a race neither of us wanted." By the late 1940s, both sides were united by a new frontier, the jet age. The piston engine belonged now to legends. Turbojets were the future. But whenever a jet prototype faltered, someone inevitably whispered, "Study how the Spitfire turned. Look at how the 109 climbed." Even in obsolescence, the two rivals continued to teach. From war machines to marvels, the Spitfire remained in service longer than anyone anticipated. While meteors and vampires carved contrails with jet flame, the old propeller fighter still scrambled for air defense and reconnaissance in Commonwealth skies. The RF kept it operational until 1954, more than 19 years after its maiden flight, an eternity in aviation years. Each surviving engine note was a living memory of 1940, stretching across a new era that barely remembered the threat of invasion. The Bf 109, confined by politics, never enjoyed such longevity in Germany. Yet its design seeded the DNA of countless aircraft that followed. Its narrow fuselage and high-lift wing sections echoed later in the Sabre, the MiG-15, and even the F-86, whose designers studied German aerodynamics captured after the war. In a sense, the Messerschmitt's pursuit of pure performance outlived the regime that conceived it. The Spitfire gave the world something heavier than engineering: identity. For an island nation that had once stood alone, it became a cultural heartbeat. Children drew it in pencil on ration paper. Poets compared its arc through the sky to hope itself. To this day, when a Merlin engine starts on a museum airfield, crowds fall silent, as if a cathedral organ had begun to play. In contrast, post-war Germany faced its past through silence. Yet among former Luftwaffe veterans, the memory of the Bf 109 inspired neither shame nor nostalgia, but melancholy respect. Many remembered it as their one reliable friend during chaos. In interviews decades later, pilot Erich Hartmann, the highest-scoring ace in history, spoke of his aircraft not as weapon but as companion. "She kept me alive when nothing else did." For him, the Bf 109 was not the tool of tyranny, but the expression of what a craftsman could achieve, even in impossible times. Legends reunited in 1968, when filmmakers shot Battle of Britain. History allowed the two rivals to meet again, not in combat but in choreography. Original Spitfires lifted from museums, Spanish-built 109s taxied beside them under Mediterranean sun. For the first time in decades, their engines thundered together without malice. Old veterans visited the set and watched tears gather beneath aviation goggles none of them needed anymore. One British pilot said, voice trembling, "That sound, it's not war, it's youth." And perhaps that is why the tale endures, not as a record of destruction, but as a recollection of humanity at its sharpest, when survival bred invention and invention birthed beauty. What they left behind. When engineers assess both aircraft today, the verdict is balanced and poetic. The Bf 109 taught the world that precision could be art. Compact frames, streamlined physics, a belief that exactness is invincibility. The Spitfire taught the opposite truth, that empathy in design, how a machine forgives its pilot's mistakes, is the real key to survival. In that contrast lies the legacy of 20th century engineering itself. Every modern aircraft, from passenger jet to stealth fighter, carries traces of both. The narrow, utilitarian efficiency of the German school, the responsive harmony of the British. And both grew not from peace, but from the crucible of necessity. Today, at air shows around the world, the two are seen again, silver and green, twisting across blue skies in a dance no longer lethal. The Spitfire's wings cut their effortless arc. The 109 dives, turns, pulls up, and joins formation, wingtips nearly touching. On the ground, cameras click. In the sky, their rivalry becomes reflection. proof that enemies can evolve into symbols of shared excellence. A story without enemies. If the war had never happened, these two aircraft might still have existed, one born from British artistry, the other from German discipline. But without conflict, they would never have met, never forced each other into greatness. Perhaps that is the tragedy of genius. Beauty discovered through necessity, peace purchased at the cost of fire. For those who survived, memory replaced hatred. RAF veterans would later admit that the first time they flew against jets, those cold, soulless contraptions of metal and math, they missed the old fight. At least you could see your enemy then, one said, and hear the courage in his engine. The final measure of victory belonged not to either side, but to time. The Spitfire proved the power of human adaptability. The Bf 109 proved the reach of precision. Between them lies the entire arc of 20th century innovation, the distance between craft and machine, between art and algorithm. Even now, 85 years later, when a restored Spitfire lifts off on a calm morning and a surviving Bf 109 joins it, no one watching thinks of flags or empires. They think of wind, of courage, of the hands that built those wings under blackout and bomber raid. Because this rivalry was never truly about nations. It was about people who met technology halfway and made it human. When the engines fade into horizon silence, they leave behind one truth that history rarely grants. The Spitfire and the Bf 109 did not define victory or defeat. They defined what it means to create something worth remembering. The silence that followed was not peace, only the sound of history turning its page.